Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode I'm doing of Encounters Debunked, Truth or Myth. Now, this series that I'm starting is going to be kind of a cool way for you guys to get to know me in more of a podcast kind of style. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is taking various encounters and episodes that I've previously narrated and going through them story by story, or a few stories at a time, and breaking down parts of the story just based on information that I know that maybe you guys are all familiar with, that basically either point it to truth or myth. As you guys know, there are quite a few stories on my channel that I'm pretty sure are just aspiring fiction writers wanting their spotlight, whereas others are more genuine and breathe truth into the light of Dogman and other cryptids. So I'm really excited to start this off with you guys. So for today's pick, I decided to do a handful of stories from my infamous 10 Dogman encounters featuring ZAKBABYTV. Now, to start this off, when me and him did that video, he had sent me 5 stories that I believe he writ himself, and the stories that I accumulated were actually sent in to me. I'm not sure. Looking back on the stories, I'm actually kind of having a hard time remembering if I remember them being fiction or true encounters, just because I go through so many stories and narrate them, and it was a few weeks back, so I don't really remember them off the top of my head, but that's what this podcast is for. So we're going to actually go back through a few of them, like I had said, and let's break them down. So let's start with the very first encounter of that episode. So let's check it out. I work as a road construction laborer. One day, earlier this year in 2019, I was in southwestern Kansas, just a few miles from Colorado and Oklahoma borders. We were closing a main highway for stripe removal to allow the county to restripe it. The day was going slow. The water grinder truck was overheating and having a few problems, and I found it my turn to be the flagman since I was a new hire to this company. The fields around me seemed to be empty farmland and pastures of emerald and amber grass. There were hills and large segments of trees. I couldn't see how far back they went, but they were thick. Okay, so already we're kind of jumping right into the story. He's giving you a little bit of information about himself, kind of giving you a little bit of information about the lay of the land. He's talking about the pastures around him and that there's a lot of farmland and there's a lot of trees and forestation. So already right here, this is pretty much after going through hundreds and hundreds of cryptid and dogmen and Bigfoot encounters, this is like, I don't want to say stereotypical, but it's definitely... It definitely sets the scene appropriately versus him being in an urban setting, in which encounters in urban settings do happen. But for some reason, cryptids seem to really like farmland and a lot of forestation, as I'm sure many of you know, and a lot of open pastures. That seems to be huge, especially with Dogman. And he had mentioned the farmland, and so the only thing I can think that's synonymous with farmland is cornfields. And as many of you know, dogmen are really synonymous with cornfields and, being in them and having encounters around them, especially in the Indiana and Illinois area and Michigan, where there's a lot of that going on, even Iowa, I believe. So this is already kind of setting the tone for what could be, a true cryptid encounter that actually has grounds to it. So let's continue on. There was a hole in the electric barbed wire fence next to me. Well, a few hours into the day, I feel an odd sensation and look in the direction it feels like it's coming from, and see a large black dog running through the field near the trees, maybe 100 yards away from me. I don't think anything about it, though. Okay, looking back on the original narration, I definitely could have done a much better job of reading that story, but that's for a different time, I guess. So already he's talking about seeing a large black dog or black dog shape running through the fields and pastures about 100 yards away. Again, this is a really common occurrence that seems to happen. Not so much the distance, but more so, I'm sure as many of you know, black dogs. Like that, it seems to be a really common thing, especially with dogmen. I know dogmen can come in many colors. I know there's been reported brown, there's been reported gray and white, but there's something about black, that kind of black timber wolf theme seems to be running really strong among the many encounters that have been sent to me, among the many encounters that I've personally read online on various sites like Reddit and Phantoms and Monsters and other sources like that, as well as just being sent. So I think there might be a little truth to this already, because he's just some blue collar worker doing some construction, doing his thing. And he's around by a bunch of farmland and fields and pastures, and there's this large black dog thing running around 100 or so yards away from him, but enough that he could visibly see that there's something there. Now, as far as my experience goes, the only really thing that would be running around like that, a big black dog, it would have to be a Great Dane, specifically a black Great Dane, or a black timber wolf, which neither of those are really likely, especially out where he's kind of talking about that he is. Especially considering, I mean, if you think about it, like a Great Dane, for example, the breed of a Great Dane, they're not highly energetic dogs. They're kind of more on the lazier side. So I really doubt you're going to see an extra alpha male black Great Dane running out in the middle of nowhere. It's very possible. Let's say someone's dog got loose. It is very possible, but it's not likely. Now, a timber wolf, I don't know necessarily the shades in which a timber wolf comes in. I know there are such things as black wolves, but I don't know how often black wolves occur. I don't know what that looks like in the wild, but I can tell you that it's probably not a black wolf running around. And if he's mentioning the size of it, well, that just kind of tips it off. Especially like if you check out Vic Cundiff's Dogman Encounter show, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, hence why you're drawn to my show and encounters, you're probably going to know that there's a lot of sightings on there that talk about, seeing a large black wolf on all fours running around and causing mischief or just causing fear. So yeah, let's continue on with the story. Later, the owner of the property comes out to fix his fence, and I ask him about his dog since I couldn't tell what kind of dog it was. And he looks at me like I'm speaking Greek and tells me, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have any dogs with me on the farm." I then told him about what I had seen, and he looked at the hole in the fence and then the trees and drove back up to his house, and that's how the story ends. I never heard from him again. Never seen the dog or felt the feeling again. Okay, so something really interesting about this particular story is he talks about the hole in the fence, but I don't think he ever really goes into detail about how big the hole is. So that's kind of a toss-up, which kind of makes me think more closer to a myth, but again, could be hard to tell. But he also talks about having that strange feeling. But again, does he mean, like he's being watched? Is he talking about the feeling of dread and gloom and doom? He never really specifies, so it's kind of a toss-up in the middle. But he talked to the farm owner, who obviously doesn't have a dog anywhere on the property. And again, I highly doubt there would be just a Great Dane, an alpha male black Great Dane running around on the property, doing its thing. So I doubt that's the case, as well as a black timber wolf running around. So it's kind of hard to say. This could kind of go either way. I'm probably going to say it's more on the truth side of things, because this person seems like they're just a genuine, regular, everyday Joe Blow. They're not out to write a fictional story. Obviously, if someone has really heavily studied these kind of encounters and stories, this is a story that you can write up on your own, considering it has all the basic ingredients. Seeing a large black dog from 100 or so feet away, you have the feelings of, well, what we can assume were being watched or feeling doom. You even have the environment and the outside setting just right too, just with a lot of field and pastures and farmlands. So assuming that this guy is just a regular dude, which he kind of seemed to be. And when he reached out to me, he seemed pretty genuine. So I'm going to go ahead and put this as true, just because there are many other stories which I can kind of tell are more on the fictional side of things. So let's go ahead and move to story 2. My father had a strange experience in the fall. October, I believe. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. I believe him firmly. He's never been a nonsense, joker, or anything like that. My dad hates those kinds of people and doesn't believe in anything really. For him, to be making this up would be drastically out of character, and he'd have nothing to gain from it. This has really upset him just because he's a pretty firm atheist and doesn't believe anything outside the realm of science. He's always been pretty vocal about how bullshit UFOs, Bigfoot, demons, God, etc. is. Anyway, this is his story. So generally, someone who's more agnostic or leans atheistic or is just generally a skeptic, encounters and things like this happen to be much more profound on them because it's cognitive dissonance. It shakes their whole reality of what they thought they knew and presents them something new that they never thought was even possible, especially an encounter like this one. I actually remember reading this one. This one, again, was sent to me as well, and I remember reading it, and I don't ever think I thought it was false. Usually there's some like details in the story, like the dad like urinates himself or something along those lines, or just, they can express genuine fear because they're not open to that. And so it happens and they realize that these things exist. And like I said, it just shakes them to the core and it kind of opens up their eyes to this whole world that unfortunately exists. So let's listen to it more. He and my mother separated when I was very little, so growing up I've always moved back and forth between them. My dad ended up getting a different job that was a couple 100 miles away, and they offered to relocate him. He stuck all of his stuff in a U-Haul trailer and traveled. My father made this drive later at night because he needed to start the job sooner than later, and it is what he told me. He didn't want to waste any time. So if I remember right, one of the details that the person who emailed the story to shared to me is that the dad got this job, and I think he had to start on like the following Monday, and I can't remember how long of the trip it was, but he literally had to be at a place where he could start the job the following morning, which is why he had to leave. I think this is important for those to know, because if you were just to listen to this and, he had to go and start this job, I don't know, for me, I can kind of like, I guess just think of that as just another passing detail in the story that would maybe make it seem false, but just trying to add credit to the story. But when you get like little bits of information like this through email or through the person telling you the account, that actually kind of helps to verify the story and gives it more life to make it seem more truthful, if that helps. He ended up coming to a more desolate section of the road in Mississippi where he needed to pull over and empty his bladder from all the coffee he had been drinking. Okay, stopping it right here. For those of you that don't know, Mississippi specifically and Oklahoma, there's a few other states. Oklahoma's a really crazy one too, but definitely Mississippi. Specifically, Taylor, Mississippi. I don't know how far away he was from there, but again, Mississippi is a hotbed for aggressive dogmen and rougarou encounters and whatnot. So I know some people don't believe in the rougarou, but honestly, in my opinion, the rougarou is literally just another word for dogman. And if someone says they saw a rougarou, they're basically just talking about a dogman. I believe it's what the French call them, if I'm not mistaken. The town of Taylor, Mississippi, if any of you want to get online right now and do some research on it, that town is a hotbed for these type of encounters. If you go ahead and do some research into it, you'll find all sorts of accounts from that area. I believe there's some other stories floating around that talk about people running into these things just in that general area. But they're pretty well seen, and they live and thrive in that area pretty strongly. So the fact that he's stopping here is kind of a huge. It already kind of just sets the tone of the story for like, oh man, of course he goes into pretty much the red zone where these things are, and of course he has to stop. So yeah, let's hear more. He gets out. The cab light is on, mind you, and he's taking a piss. He starts to get a weird feeling, like he could sense something was wrong. He tells me he felt like he was being watched and that his gut instincts told him to turn around. When he did, this tall, wolf-like creature stepped out from behind his trailer. He said it was blacker than black, and it had piercing yellow eyes. This story actually has a lot of really good encounter details in it. So right off the bat, he feels something wrong, and he turns around and he sees this wolf creature. Now, the first instinct he had, as well as many people do, is there's just an overall feeling of something wrong. I believe that's your gut instinct just telling you there's a predator, and it's time for fight or flight. And so the way he describes this thing as, which is very interesting if you listen to what he says, he says it's blacker than black. And I've heard that in several other encounters. Now, what this usually refers to is that it is so black that it almost absorbs light. Now, listen to what I just said. It is so black that it almost absorbs light. You will hear that in several other encounters, especially if you look at, if you listen to Vic Hundif. There's a couple encounters where they talk about that. These things aren't just black; they are this unnatural, blacker than black. It's literally just like I said. It absorbs light. Jet black. I mean, these things are dark. So to hear someone who's more atheistic and describes this creature using those specific descriptions, it's to me it comes off as very genuine. It's frightening, to say the least, because it kind of just validates that, holy shit, these things exist. At least I believe they do, just from the encounters that I've come across. But and then he talks about the piercing yellow eyes. Now let's talk about the eyes for a moment. If you look at a lot of Dogmen specifically encounters, you will notice that there's several colors that you'll hear about, but primarily, I guess three technically. Okay, so three primary colors that you'll hear about. You'll hear red, you'll hear amber. I believe amber is the most common, and then you'll hear yellow from time to time. So if we were to rank it from like most popular to least common, it would definitely be amber. And then red, in my opinion, is right underneath it. Red glowing eyes, and then yellow. So the fact that he even saw, and I'm not sure why there's a differentiation between, glowing amber, glowing red, glowing yellow. I don't know. I don't know if it has anything to do with light diffraction or the time of day or distance or what, but again, he used very specific descriptions of this thing. Someone who's probably going to have no knowledge of this being or anything about it at all. So to use these specific descriptions, it kind of just, to me, says a lot. And I'm someone who has read hundreds, and I'm serious, hundreds of encounters of not just Dogmen, but Bigfoot as well. I've been researching this stuff for years. I've been studying it. When you listen to a lot of talk shows, you're doing a lot of research on the internet, it's really easy for you to be able to gather this kind of intel and put together whether someone's basically full of shit or not. So, yeah, let's continue on. He said at first glance, it reminded him of something from the movie The Howling, except more evil looking, he said. My dad was still pissing when this happened, and so he's staring at this wolf creature, urinating all over himself and his feet as this thing bares its huge, sharp teeth at my dad. Now, this is also interesting, too. He makes the resemblance to a creature from the movie The Howling. And for those of you that aren't aware, The Howling is, I don't know if it was one of the first, but I think it was one of the first bigger werewolf motion pictures in the U.S. I think it came out 81, somewhere in the early 80s, but I want to say it kind of started that trend of werewolf movies, or was right around that time. It was after American Werewolf in London, but I think it was before correct me if I'm wrong, for anyone out there listening who knows these. Stephen King did a movie, I want to say it was either 84 or 86, called The Silver Bullet. Or excuse me, no, I think it's Cycle of the Werewolf. Anyway, if any of you have read the book, it's a really good book. But again, this movie, or that movie, was a little bit after. And there's multiple movies in the Howling series. I actually have not seen the Howling series at all, but I've seen stills from it, and so I kind of know what he's talking about as far as what the creature looks like. I've also seen the costume. Yeah. Anyway, so the fact that he's able to make a visual depiction of what this thing is based on a movie he's seen, I mean, that's just terrifying right there. What's also interesting to me, and another reason why I want to add in this anecdote into into this episode, is because that isn't the first time I've heard other people make descriptions of or classify that as looking like that particular creature. There's been other times in other stories that I've read or I've just gotten emails from where people described it the same way, and specifically the Howling. I know there's other times I've heard, if any of you have ever seen the movie Dog Soldiers, same way. I've heard a couple descriptions of that. And then the Van Helsing. At the very end, I think it's the 2004 version of Van Helsing, there is the fight between Van Helsing when he turns into this massive werewolf and he fights the vampire. A lot of people will also draw depictions of that werewolf scene or werewolf fight. And again, you could just Google these if you have no idea what I'm talking about. So you could just Google werewolf fight Van Helsing and you'll see the werewolf. He's this massive bodybuilder, black hulking werewolf, extremely frightening looking. And the fact that there's been multiple witnesses that have said, oh yeah, what I saw looks a lot like that or looks exactly like that, that's terrifying. And it also goes to show you that there's more than one type of dogman, as some of you are more than aware of. So yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, let's listen more. He told me he thought he was going to die and be eaten. Just in that moment, another car was coming around the bend behind where my dad pulled off, and the headlights from their vehicle illuminated this wolf creature. Apparently, the headlights must have distracted the creature because it turned around to face the oncoming car. My dad did not even think. He just bolted right for his truck, jumped in and slammed the doors and threw it into drive. As this was going on, apparently the car that had come around the bend saw this creature since their headlights had hit it, and it turned to face them. He said it sounded like they did the fastest brakes squeaking and doing a full 180 turn around to avoid this animal. There's no way they didn't see it. He says he only heard it because he was so focused on getting back in his vehicle. He says his penis was still out and he had urine all over his pants and feet. Even though that's the only humorous part of the story, he said he didn't even have time to zip back up and he was trying to get out of there so fast. Okay, again guys, obviously this man is so terrified that not only has he urinated all over himself, but he couldn't even zip himself back up properly. I mean, he just bolted right for his truck to get the hell out of Dodge. So just adding more validity to the story, adding more truth, making it more genuine. So far, stories like these, it's not so much of how they're written, it's more so what they say and the flow of the story. And, it's something that's really hard to describe, but for those of you out there who are also experts on the subject, who read a lot of these stories, who understand eyewitnesses and things like that, you can kind of get a feel for certain encounters, and to me, this is just one that stands out as truth. This thing held onto his trailer, and as he pulled it into drive, he felt so much resistance that the vehicle was now struggling to move. He heard this thing, let out a roar, and did not even want to look in his side mirrors to see the thing. He floored it as hard as he could, and this thing let go and he flew off. Eventually, he made it to where he had to go without any damage to him or his trailer miraculously. He said that he has no idea what the fuck that thing was, but swears to this day he will never set another foot in that God-forsaken state with those things living in it. He told me, too, that after everything, if there is anything he would have ever encountered in his years on this earth, that was pure evil. It was the worst and ugliest animal he's ever seen. He just couldn't get over the feeling that it gave off. He described it as cruel. He felt this thing just didn't even want to kill him. It just wanted him to be afraid and to suffer at the hands of it. He says he doesn't know what better way to relay that but what he felt from this thing. I'm the only person
so we end story 4, and let me just say this, and I want to give some clarification because I've seen some comments on my videos where people don't understand this description. So he mentions that this creature was pure evil. So there's been a couple of people that mock that description and say, well, if it was pure evil, he would have died. No. The point is they're not understanding what they mean by pure evil. Pure evil is not the intent per se. Pure evil is the feeling they give off, the emotion, the vibe, their aura, I guess you want to say. You can sense evil off of somebody. You can sense evil off of these creatures. I mean, ask many of the people who have encountered these things. And a lot of times in those cases, these creatures didn't have quote unquote malicious intent, or they didn't actually hurt anybody. Their whole, again, it kind of goes back to their whole demeanor being they are there to terrify, they're there to scare you, and they're there to cause trauma for whatever reason. I'm not sure, but then they usually leave or go away. Now, Wyatt held onto his trailer and let him go. I don't know. Wyatt bared its teeth at him and didn't just attack him and kill him right there. I don't know. We all know that it easily could have. He could have had his life ended right there. He could have been eaten. We're not sure why. So it's just one of those things where it kind of just lines up with all these other, when you look at truer encounters and you hear how valid some of these people are and how they talk, and you could hear the fear in their voice, this to me comes across as one of those encounters. Even though it wasn't the actual dad telling the encounter, I can almost feel it through the way this person wrote the story, or that they wrote the account from him to me. So this is a story that I would definitely classify as truth. Anyone out there listening to this, I would say that, like, listen to this story again in the actual episode and kind of just like, you know, pick up on those details and use that for future encounters that you hear any other time with Dogman. I mean, not only so much the way he described it, but just, you know, not everyone just has genuine fear like that. When they know their life is in danger and they're coming across something that is not only unknown but isn't supposed to exist, that we've grown up our entire lives being told it doesn't exist, it's a fairy tale, and then we come face to face with it. It's not always the easiest thing. Some people are a lot more emotionally scarred, whereas this guy kind of just seems like he wants to keep it to himself, which is very common. And that's the other part of it too. A lot of people don't want to face ridicule, so they keep it to themselves. And I think now you're starting to see more and more people coming out of the woodworks, expressing their encounters, being open about it, because they're starting to see a community around it. They're starting to see people opening up and actually not being afraid anymore to tell about it. And those who are traumatized, they can finally have an outlet for it. And they can finally let people know that, hey, these things exist and you need to watch out for them and you need to be careful. Even though there's accounts, well, most accounts on here are of people who have not gotten hurt. Unfortunately, I hate to break this to you guys, but there are quite a few encounters that there are people who have gotten hurt and or killed. Those encounters aren't really as easy to get a hold of because they're usually covered up. But a perfect example, and look this up right now if you want to look into it more. It's called The Land Between the Lakes. Listen to that. The Land Between the Lakes. I believe it happened between Tennessee and Kentucky, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's basically was a family in a camper that was a family of 4, a mom, a dad, a little girl, and a little boy. And they were all butchered, and I mean butchered, by this 8-foot dog creature thing. And later on, the military went in, some secret branch of government went in, although I believe it was the military, found this 8-foot dogman creature about, I want to say a mile and a half away on the side of a cliff in a cave,
killed it and retrieved the body. So look into it if you want to know more about that, but that's probably like the biggest case I know. But they shut that whole area down. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is this stuff happens, and it's good to be aware of it. Hello, and boy, do I have a fun story for you. I have a friend who is a sheriff, and even though he gave me permission to share this, he swore to me that I was not ever allowed to tell what county he held jurisdiction in. I'll respect that and just tell you he had an interesting case. The case happened years back, but the story itself is pretty grim. He had responded to a call of an animal break-in on a more rural property. Upon arriving at the scene, there was blood, claw marks, and what he could only describe as dog hair everywhere. An older couple lived there at the house by themselves, and apparently what had happened was this large animal that the people described as looking like a demonic timber wolf broke into the house, attacked the husband, and attacked the wife, then dragged the wife outside and took her away. See, guys, exactly what I was just talking about. This is a really good example of one of the accounts that I, again, was just talking about where it's more covered up, but, police show up at the door and there's blood, there's claw marks, there's hair, and someone was attacked and or killed in this particular story. But, when there's a lot of cover-ups and things going on to hide it, it's kind of hard for these details to get out unless you work in law enforcement, government branch or agencies or military. And I think a lot of that is for fear. If a lot of people knew that these things are out there, I mean, you'd have hysteria. So let's listen more. The husband was clawed up pretty bad and was nearly unconscious due to blood loss. Paramedics arrived quickly at the scene and took the man to the hospital where, after several blood transfusions, he survived. He was in real bad shape. He looked like he'd been mauled almost to death by a bear. It was ugly shit. He searched the area high and low, but could only find traces of blood here and there. He called in a crew to come in and help and search, and about 700 yards away from the house, up in a tree, they found the wife. She was ripped open, disemboweled, and what scares me most about this particular case is it literally mirrors the Land Between the Lakes story, because I think in that one, the very last body they found was the little girl, and it was the same thing. Her body was strung up in a tree, probably about 20 or 30 feet up in some branches, basically partially eaten, disemboweled, the whole 9 yards. And it kind of just like, when you run into these cross details of these stories, it's like there is some validity to these. There's some truth, especially when it's being reported by law enforcement, and because they don't necessarily know about these other stories and cases that have happened. So I'm not sure why some dogmen or why some of these creatures are violent like this. I don't know. I can't answer all those questions, but it's frightening. When you hear stuff like this, it really makes your skin crawl to know that, just this regular everyday couple, I'm sure, was just sitting at home enjoying their evening, and then this thing broke in their house, like literally off of some horror movie, and almost killed the guy and took his wife and ate her. Who knows what provoked that? It's hard to tell, but again, it just kind of makes your skin crawl when you hear about this stuff. Let's listen more. She was also up about 60 or 70 feet up in the tree, hanging loosely on a branch, or what was left of her. She was pretty mangled, and the only real way she could have been identified was because the man said that his wife was missing. Identification for her was a little bit tougher. This thing had apparently not only disemboweled her and torn off some of her limbs to eat, but also her face was torn off,
and her jaw was missing. It was a gory, bloody mess. There were blood and pieces of her innards all over the tree and the ground. Now, my sheriff friend tells me when there's an animal attack like this, he has to call in a special number. He made sure to be extremely vague and couldn't give me any information on who or what this number is. He refused to give me any more information about what he knows and when to call said number, etc. Anyway, he calls this number, and the next day, a special branch of military shows up with advanced
Now already
sonar
this
weaponry.
is more frightening than usual, because now you have the secret branch of military coming in with advanced weaponry, and usually their weapon of choice for these particular beings is sonar weaponry. Now that tells me that this branch of military and the government knows these things exist. They've even built weaponry to deal with said situation, and it's the fact that they would use sonar weaponry tells me that they know a lot about these beings, more than we could ever do. So sonar weaponry would probably be used, for those who are unaware about it, would be used to emit a certain frequency that would either be harmful or would have some meaning to drive these creatures far away from the area. If it's sonar weaponry, that tells me that it's so advanced and high-powered that it's either going to kill or just make them leave the area. So, again, when I hear that kind of thing, only a few people know about that kind of stuff. And so, again, it just adds more validity to the story. It adds more truth. The fact that it's shared by a law enforcement personnel is also scary, because you're starting to see more of that nowadays more than ever. Government officials, people who work in the military, coming forward, staying anonymous, but still telling what they know. I think because people just can't stomach what's going on, and some people just want other people to know, what's happening. A lot of people forget, people in the military, the police, law enforcement, government, there's a lot of people, just everyday people like you and me, who think that, civilians, people should know about this stuff, what's going on. So anyway, when you hear about these details, it just adds more truth to the story, and it kind of just, it raises the hair on the back of your neck, to be honest, especially when they talk about the exact type of sonar weaponry that they're using. It's quite unnerving. Let's listen more.
Obviously still being in the hospital at this point, and the wife being taken to the morgue. This branch of military goes about a mile or two in every direction when they showed up. They demanded that everyone from CSI to the police department leave now, and the case's jurisdiction now belonged to this branch of government. Again, my friend would not reveal the branch's name. He said there are several hidden branches of government civilians have no idea even exist and will never know about. There are branches that are purposefully hidden for specific purposes and missions that the government carries out. After leaving the scene and letting this branch go clear out whatever this thing was, he never really found out what became of the situation other than a few things. Number 1, the husband survived after his tenure in the hospital. Number 2, the house and property was seized immediately by the U.S. government, and all ownership was stripped from the husband, who happened to be the original owner. Number 3, they apparently had dealt with the issue. Lastly, my friend was told not to speak of this case to anybody for any reason. I grew up with this friend, and we're very close, and he decided to keep it for a long time. I'm one of the only people he has ever told, if not the only person, due to him potentially losing his job, or worse, his life. I understand that there are certain things he can't ever share with the world, but he told me this was so heavy on his conscience that he had to let it out some way or another. He allowed me to share it to the world under the ruling that I not release his name or county it happened in. I hope your readers find this as interesting as I have.
Again, guys, this just falls in line with everything we've been talking about this entire episode. it's true that I've heard from other law enforcement personnel that there is government agencies that civilians will never know exist, and that they exist for specific purposes, unbeknownst to us, and that they are used for specific things and missions. And I believe this branch of government that he contacted is designed for the purpose that it took care of in this story. I don't know if all law enforcement personnel have a specific number that they call or a team that they call for these kinds of issues. I don't know how that works, but this is just what the sheriff relayed to this individual who relayed this to me. And again, it's kind of the same thing, that he's just another person who it's heavy on his conscience. You know, he's been told not to talk about it, which happens in a lot of cases for military, government, even park rangers. They're told not to talk about it. Why? I don't know. So, you know, some of these people, they just can't hold it in forever, and, you know, they need to let it out. So my conclusion for this story is that it is also true. So in the midst of all these 5 stories, you know, there's going to be a couple that lean maybe in the middle, maybe 1 or 2 that lean false. But for the most part, I believe that a lot of my stories I get are true based on facts that I know, based on information that I know, and previous knowledge and experience, as well as just knowing eyewitnesses and things like that. And then you can kind of get, you know, the fiction writers in here and there. So I want people to know that I try and be as open as I can with people's encounters, and I also try to read and post as many encounters as I can, because even if someone is just, you know, giving me a work of fiction, if it's a good story, it's a good story. I mean, I'll still post it. I try to never claim it's a true encounter unless it's, I guess, specifically in the title. But I think that, you know, even a story of fiction has entertainment value to it. And, you know, someone like me who loves true cryptid encounters, I can get entertainment value even knowing it is a fiction story. Even like, you know, creepypastas and stuff like that, they're still entertaining to me. Obviously, if some of them are unbearably unrealistic, I can see how that might tinge the experience. But I feel like for the most part, even the fictional stories still are at a level of realism where they're still enjoyable, at least to an extent. Some of my audience may disagree, but I feel like most of you have still been able to enjoy them. However, like I said, I feel like most of the encounters that I get are actually real, and they are quite enjoyable, just on varying degrees, with some being extremely truthful and some maybe, you know, adding in some details to add excitement to the story. I've ran into that quite a few times. But anyway, guys, I'm going to wrap this episode up for today. So this concludes episode 1 of Truth or Myth, Encounters Debunked. I hope to see you all in episode 2, and I will catch you then. Have a wonderful day, everyone. I'll see you then.